let's get this show on the road. Before I even start with introductions, I want to ask a quick question, and it's mainly directed at everyone. Who here has a subscription to a local or regional newspaper? 2, 3, okay, 4. You should be thinking about this. We're facing times of information deficits. The only way we get our knowledge is from reporters, and then those of you who are communications students, you probably understand that already, but it's crucial that we have the pipeline for reporters going up towards maybe going to work at the Washington Post or New York Times, but they've got to start somewhere, and they can't do that unless the newspapers are funded, and especially here where we have kind of an independent group of newspapers, that's kind of a really valuable resource that we should all be supporting. Okay, that's me, I'm off the soapbox now. There's the real experts over there, and I think we should get the introduction started. My name is Richard Elgar. I'm the Associate Director here at the Foley Institute, and I'd like to welcome you all here today. Thanks for coming along. And I also want to take a moment to thank the Murrow College of Communication. We've been running this Media and Politics Symposium with a bit of a break for COVID since, as I discovered today, March 2010. So this is now officially 15 years of this with that small gap that I've previously mentioned. So I want to thank publicly the Murrow College for their collaboration on this event. But let's go straight to the introduction of our esteemed panelists, and I'm going to introduce them alphabetically and left to right and in order of presentation, it turns out. We sorted this out really well ahead of time, and it was completely not by chance. Jennifer Henrichsen is a journalism studies professor in the Edward R. Murrow College of Communication here at WSU. She is also research director of the Washington Local News Ecosystem Project, about which I think we'll be finding out some details later on, and senior personnel with the Viceroy Northwest Institute for Cybersecurity Education and Research. To her left and our right, we have Matthew Powers, who is professor in the Department of Communication and co-director of the Department's Center for Journalism, Media and Democracy at the University of Washington, about which I shall say no more. Finally, to Matt's left and our right, we have Benjamin Shores, who is chair of the Department of Journalism and Media Production and a professor of practice, also here at the Murrow College of Communication. And if you could join me in welcoming our got the clicker right there.
Okay, great. Hello, everybody. It's great to be here. I'm going to share some new research that I've been leading as research director for the Local News Ecosystem Project at Washington State University. And I know that today's event focuses on state capitol reporting, but it's important to also understand the broader landscape of the local news ecosystem in Washington. So I'll be talking about that today as a start. So to begin, I'd like to just acknowledge that this research was possible with funding through appropriations from the Washington State Legislature, which gave money to the Murrow News Fellowship Program to establish an amazing program that Ben will be talking about a little bit later. And we were able to conduct some research to try to understand what's happening on the ground across the state as it relates to local news capacity. So our report focuses on documenting and evaluating Washington State's local news ecosystem and identifying gaps in the ecosystem as well as potential ways to remedy them. And we also have a visualized map of local news sources by location to help citizens across the state be able to know where to find news in their communities. And if Richard wants to just click on that map, I'll briefly show it. It's not yet publicly available. It'll be released when our report is released. But what you can see here is this is showing newspapers across the state. If you click on the blue button, the first blue button, it will show online only publications and where they're centralized. The bigger circles indicate more. If you hover over the circle, you can see a list of the different types of outlets that are associated with that geographic location. And then we also have radio, TV, and magazine coverage. And so this is sort of to be a resource for citizens who might not know which outlets are available to them in their geographic communities. All right. And so in our research, we had a number of guiding questions, including what sources provide local news coverage in Washington, right? There hasn't been a significant comprehensive map. This is the first of its kind that deals with radio, TV, newspapers, magazines, and online first publications. we're also curious to understand what are the characteristics, right, of these different news organizations. So what are the types? What are the ownership structures, right? Because these all have really important implications for what types of news get published, what types of coverage is available. And then similarly, what are some of the gaps, right, in the local news ecosystem, and how can we remedy these, right? That's a very important aspect of the research. So we developed the database using first a lot of different publicly available sources, and so we ended up with a list of about more than 1,000 outlets to evaluate. And we used different criteria, both content and content quality criteria, as well as locality criteria, to determine if an outlet fit or not in the database. And we also needed, of course, to have a website, right? Because we were evaluating the content. And so some of the outlets were excluded because they didn't have a web presence, but in other cases, they were excluded because they did not provide locally relevant content, or it wasn't considered original or journalistic in nature. And so we ended up resulting in about 353 outlets for the database. And we were trying to find a lot of different information related to the outlets as well. So we were interested in understanding the staffing numbers, the annual operating budget, right? Like really key characteristics of these outlets to understand whether or not they're doing well or not. And some of that data was really hard to find. So we ended up conducting a survey and sent that to the 353 outlets that were in our database. And we asked them a lot of these questions related to budget and staffing and other sources of information. And then we also wanted to hear from local civic leaders and journalists and scholars about their interpretation of local news within Washington to determine whether or not they thought things were going well, things were challenging, and the like. And our findings revealed that Washington State is not immune to the local journalism crisis that is facing the nation, right? We found that less populous rural areas are particularly lacking in news outlets. At the same time, some denser urban areas are lacking as well when you factor in their population density. And we found 2 counties with no news outlets meeting our criteria, and 5 counties with only 1 news outlet. So this indicates, right, that media diversity is challenged across the state. There's uneven distribution of these outlets serving their communities. And our analysis suggests that in line with prior research, as a consequence, marginalized and low-income communities may be the most disadvantaged in terms of local news. We also wanted to better understand how many full-time editorial staff there are at news outlets, right? This is a big concern among many, both in the legislature and elsewhere. And out of 144 outlets that responded to our survey, 54% had 2 or fewer full-time editorial employees, which is pretty mind-blowing if you think about the need for journalists to get out in their communities and report on key issues, right, of civic importance. We also wanted to understand what types of resources these local news organizations had at their disposal, and we found that a significant portion of outlets actually have an annual operating budget of less than $250,000, and that's for the whole year, which is pretty incredible if you think about what they're trying to do in their communities and how few resources they have available. And then we talked to journalists, civic leaders, and scholars. We had 32 different interviews, and they revealed to us that ownership consolidation, especially by national chains, compounds the challenges facing local news organizations, in part because competing newspapers merge, right? And then they lay off workers, which is part of the trend that we saw with the low numbers of editorial full-time staff. And inadequate compensation also makes it difficult both to retain journalists and also to recruit future ones. So what we found was the cost of living is too high for some of the journalists who are covering their communities, and so they have to live elsewhere and then commute in to report. And that affects the quality of news coverage. It affects the trust that audiences might have in the coverage that they're seeing. To navigate financial hardship, news organizations increasingly turn to freelancers and volunteers too to generate content for readers, but that in turn increases the precarity, right, that journalists face. And these staffing challenges are intensifying by declining news audiences, right? Legacy news organizations sometimes are not capturing or they're not retaining their audiences, in part because, as we know, a lot of people consume their news in different ways in recent years, right? Such as through social media platforms, not subscribing to newspapers or other forms of content. We also heard that a lot of consumers, when they do seek out the news, they are often not wanting to pay for it. There's a sort of sense that, information should be free, information on the internet is free, surely the newspaper that I want to read should be providing me free content, right? And then of course that reliance on social media platforms for access to information. But despite this sort of dire state of local news that we heard about from civic leaders, scholars, and journalists, there are also some positive developments. So we found that the subscription model is helping some outlets replace lost advertising revenue, not fully, of course, but it is contributing. And also direct donations are an increasingly popular way to fund local news. I'll also say that state-led initiatives like the Murrow News Fellowship Program are supporting local news by being able to put journalists in news outlets that normally wouldn't be able to pay for those news journalists in those outlets, right? Additionally, as news outlets are finding themselves in these resource-strapped environments, there's been an increase in collaboration among journalists to cover non-scoop sort of stories, right, such as sporting events, right? They sort of pool their resources. There are content sharing agreements that allow for various news outlets to use each other's stories with attribution, and that therefore they're able to provide more local content to their local audiences. Despite staffing challenges facing the journalism industry, numerous journalists are still very passionate, they're still very hardworking, right? They very much believe in the mission of journalism, and they are outfitting news organizations. News outlets are also trying to sort of address this environment by building close relationships with various audiences, right, through different types of revenue generating opportunities like membership packages or events or even newsletters to try to extend their reach, to try to make sure that audiences are meeting them where they're at. And then we also found that, that journalists have mixed feelings about AI. So there was some concern among the journalists interviewed that AI could replace jobs, right? Or it could lead to more disinformation. It could maybe contribute to more distrust in news. At the same time, they recognize perhaps it could be useful for rote tasks within journalism to sort of free them up to do other, maybe more hard-hitting stories. We also heard a lot of concern among civic leaders, right, about the decline of local news. And that's in part because local news is really proven, in many ways actually, within political communication as well as journalism studies, to be essential to public life, and also by extension a functioning democratic society. And the civic leaders in particular talked about how without local news in their communities, constituents didn't know what was happening. They would even come to the different congressional people's offices and complain that they had no idea what was going on in their communities. And that, of course, can lead to decreased civic engagement, decreased civic participation, right? The lack of local news can also result in less information for voters to make decisions on important issues. And of course, too, there is less accountability for government and other political leaders. So I want to just end with a quote from scholar Victor Picard, who has done a lot of work in the local news space, but also journalism studies more generally. And he says that we simply are not, as a society, allocating enough resources to our news media infrastructures, which really comes down to our newspaper industry predominantly. There simply is not enough money there to provide meaningful jobs for enough journalists to be doing news gathering on the ground and providing the level of news and information that is necessary for a democratic society. So with that, I'll stop and I'll turn it over to Capital Reporting, but thank you very much.
Great, thanks for that, Jen, which really does help to set up what I'm going to say. So first, thanks to the Foley Center and to Richard in particular for the hospitality and for the invitation to be here, and to the Murrow School for also hosting, but then also doing some of the research that really helps to give some of a context to this. So I'm going to say a little bit about the context of the report, but I should start just by saying a couple of things. One, you'll notice that all of this is, I've done something today that I've never done before, which is I've put all of the slides in UW colors. And I've never felt compelled to do that, but I thought maybe given the setting that it might be funny, I'm not sure. But second, that this is a report that I did with several colleagues through the Center for Journalism, Media, and Democracy. And so while I'm the one who's here sort of presenting it, We have graduate and postgraduate students, Russell Hanson and Megan Dahl, and my colleague, Patricia Moy, who's also in the Department of Communication, who have been involved in this. And so let me start just by saying something about the background of the report. And so in one sense, you can think about what I'm going to do as talking about a very, very, very small, but I think important slice of the Washington State news media world or ecosystem, or pick your metaphor. But I think you can also think about it in two other ways, which is to say that if you have no interest at all in Washington State, but maybe you're a political scientist who's interested in the relationship between state government and news media, I think that there are reasons to care about this topic. And then I'm going to suggest that there's reasons, even if you don't care about states, that you might be interested in this sort of thing. And so the first thing I'll say is that when we're talking about the relationship between state governments and news media, there's been a transformation over the past several decades on both sides. And so it used to be that states were, as one political scientist referred to it about 2 decades ago, as the, quote, runt in the litter of American policymaking. Not very nice, not a very nice thing to say about state governments, but was certainly the perception that a lot of resources were not there, that you really didn't have a whole lot of interaction between states and the federal government in terms of policy. And that is most clearly not the case now. State governments are much larger in terms of their budgets, but they are also the places where a lot of policy gets pioneered, gets tried out before it actually gets enacted at the federal level. And so in a lot of ways, if you want to get a sense of what either party is going to try and do when it gets into power, you have good reasons to look at the states. Okay? And states are also, we hope, to some degree, sort of havens for some degree of resistance. If there is someone in power or a party in power with whom you disagree, with whom you are concerned about some of the effects of some of the decisions that are being made. And so on the one hand, if you think about it as a sort of tale of two escalators, you've got state governments that are going up in importance. They're more important in the American political system than they've ever been. They have more people, they have more bills, they have more money sloshing into them, the number of lobbyists coming in. All of it is making it more important and more central. And at the same time as that's happened, partly for some of the reasons that Jen has already discussed very nicely, within news organizations, you have a sort of total transformation of the news landscape that changes who reports on state governments, how much they commit to reporting on state governments, and how they report on state governments. In one sense, I think you can think of it as like an escalator that's going down. So as I'll talk about, there are far fewer people involved in looking at this, different types of people with different types of stories. And so one of the ways you can think about this is to think about the relationship between state governments on the one hand, which are going up, news organizations, which in many ways are going down, and to ask, what does this actually mean for the types of news that people, not just in Washington State, but also around the country, are getting about policymakers that directly impact our lives in very basic ways. And I would sort of insist on the direct aspect of it, because one of the things that happens with political journalism at the national level is we often talk about important topics that are also extremely abstract. Are we losing democracy? Are we shifting to authoritarian forms of government? All of these discussions, which are extremely important, but are also abstract in the sense that they require a series of definitions that are not agreed to by everyone, that require a series of debates. When you talk about state government policy, you're talking about what's going to happen to the schools that your children go to, what's going to happen to the roads on which you drive or the trains that you take, right? How much are taxes going to go up or stay the same? So things that are like very, very concrete. So that would be one reason to look at this. The second reason to look at this is I think state capitals and reporters for state capitals are in some sense like a perfect microcosm of an issue that confronts political journalism more generally. And that's that, as the title for this panel suggests, the values of political journalism are in many ways the same as they've been for decades. We talk about informing citizens, holding the powerful to account, speaking across various lines of differences, representing diverse voices. And so you have all of these sort of very traditional, very important values. But the conditions for political journalists to be able to achieve any of this have changed. And if you can take one thing away from it, they've changed not only because of money, partly because of money, But I think we have a problem that's more than just the political economy of news. So what do I mean by that? Well, political journalists say, I'm doing all of this because I want to inform citizens. But we have a reality in which the vast majority of people will either ignore this reporting or they'll consume it in ways that reflect what they already believe in the first place. And so I have this idea that I'm doing this to inform citizens, but it's really difficult to actually do it because a lot of times people will just ignore what you report, or they won't take it, in the spirit in which it might be intended. So that's one issue. Second issue, they want to hold the powerful to account. Well, that turns out to be a lot more difficult to do in a period when politicians can choose to interact with news organizations and journalists when it suits them, and they can ignore them when it doesn't suit them. The capacity for them to hold press conferences or interviews with partisan or entertainment media are very high, and so that they can do that. And they don't need to actually go through traditional news organizations in any way. In some sense, one of the features of the relationship between the press and politics, not just in the United States, but around the world, for much of the 20th century was it was a sort of mutual dance. Journalists got something from the relationship, but politicians also got something from the relationship. They got access to audiences, right, which helped them to reach citizens. And that's much less the case now. So that part's changed, right? So you've got audiences have changed, politicians have changed, and news organizations have changed. News organizations, in some of the ways that Jen has already discussed very well, are very much in the midst of an economic crisis, which makes them much more attuned to doing and offering things that they think will help to claw back audiences in whatever form possible. And so we've got reasons to think about this from the level of state government. We've also got reasons to think about this from the level of political journalism more generally. And the general sort of question that we had is, what do these changes mean for the news that citizens receive? And what are the implications for journalism and democracy? And so what I'll do is I'll go over some of the sort of core empirical findings from the report, which will try and get at some of this. There's two sort of dimensions of the report that we did. The first dimension is we did interviews with both current and former Statehouse reporters. So we did interviews with people from someone like Dave Ammons, who had a 40-year career at the Statehouse in Olympia, to student interns who have just got there and they're just doing some of their work now. We interviewed 25 of them in total, and we were able to get, sort of, a wide variety and swath of experiences. And so we asked these people about their experiences, how things have changed over time, etc. But then the other thing we do is, that we did in the report, is that we did a content analysis looking at all the news that was produced by any news organization that had a full-time Statehouse reporter stationed in Olympia in the 2023 legislative session. Okay? Because there we wanted to see, okay, what are we actually getting? What are news audiences actually getting? And so what I'll do is I'll try and overview some of the empirical findings first, and then I'll come back to this question of what it might mean for both journalism and for democracy. So some of the findings to start, I think, are relatively unsurprising, but I think they can in some ways be encapsulated by this picture, which is a picture that I first came across in a report by the League for Women Voters, and I think in a lot of ways actually captures some of the changes. I think oftentimes people look at this picture and they say, wow, there were so many more people then and so much fewer people then, or so much fewer people now, which is true. There are fewer journalists covering Olympia on a full-time basis than there used to be. According to our count, there were 19 people assigned on a full-time basis in the year 2000 to report on a full-time basis in Olympia. Does anybody want to guess what the number is as of last year? Ben can't do it because I'm sure he probably knows. 6, a little bit higher, 8. Right? So certainly well over half. It's been cut well over half, right? And it's not just that there are fewer journalists, but there are fewer experienced journalists. And so when we looked at the median years of experience in Olympia, so the line at which half of the people have more experience and half the people have less, amongst the people who were in the Olympia press corps before 2008, which is really when the financial crisis happened and the sort of bottom fell out, the average years of experience was 17 years, or the median was 17 years. And now, as of last year, it was 2 years. 2 years of experience. Now, I want to stress something really important, that oftentimes it's easy for people to say something snarky about the newer group, that it's young, they don't know anything, but they're also in a lot of ways much better trained and have been through many more internships than some of the older groups. Now, but one of the issues with having fewer experienced journalists is you have fewer relationships, right? You're less able to do some of the investigations. So we found, for instance, only 10 investigative stories across the entire sample of news stories, which is about 800 stories total, and only 10 of them were investigative reports. Of course, investigations take a lot of time, they take a lot of money, they're hard to do, in particular, if you're the only person assigned by your news organization to cover Olympia. So to give you a clear sense of what that means, the Seattle Times, for a long time, early 2000s, had 3, sometimes 4 full-time reporters. The Associated Press, something similar. And that made it possible that you could have one person, if the governor says, I'm going to have a press conference, or a speaker says, I'm going to have a press conference, they go to it and they report on it, right? But if you're the only person and that happens, it's not just difficult, it's impossible to be able to do an investigation and at the same time do day-to-day reporting. So we've got fewer investigations, and then something that I think corresponds with what the report that Jen has spearheaded points out, a lot less rural coverage. So issues of housing affordability, which are huge at in urban and suburban areas, are 8 times more likely to receive coverage than basic issues related to agriculture. And so there's really a difference in terms of some of the topics. All of that sounds relatively negative. One of the things I want you to sort of take away from this picture, though, is that the reason that they're all there is they're all there to report on the same thing, which we might suggest is not necessarily the best use of all that manpower. And I use manpower advisedly because they were almost all men. And so we also have less of what the Statehouse reporters themselves will refer to as turn-of-the-screw reporting. This bill made it out of this committee and has now gone on to this other committee, which kind of sort of suggests that people are watching the whole time, that they know what's happening. And so there's this whole series of reductions, many of them worrisome, not all of them. But then I think we also have adaptation and renewal. What you see here is a picture of the Statehouse Press Corps at the end of last year's, I can't remember if it was last year or 2 years ago, off the top of my head. And of course, the first thing you'll notice is that it is much more young. These are all the full-time reporters who are there. We really have a new generation of reporters who are covering Olympia. They tend to be overwhelmingly female. This is a beat, political journalism in general, that has for a long time been extremely male, like super, super, super male, and that has, at the level of state houses, become very, very feminized. So much more likely to be positions occupied by women. And it also happens to be that there's a different vision of what political journalism can be. Something that was really interesting, really surprising to us when we actually carried out these interviews is we asked the people, how did you get to these jobs? And for the most part, many of them said, I'm really not that into politics. I don't like politics. Politics is not that, I kind of find it to be, particularly in its institutional form, I kind of find it to be annoying. So you ask them, well, what are you doing here? Well, the thing that they like about political reporting at the Statehouse is that it's an opportunity to see how it is that policy might impact the lives of everyday people. And so there's this big sort of shift that's going on. And it's not that they can always do stories like this, but where there's this orientation and this attempt to try and understand how it is that if this bill passed, what's it going to look like for your average citizen in town A or in city B. Right? And so there's this really sort of different idea. And a third thing is that one of the pieces that surprised us a bit is that we found that over a third of all stories that are covered about the legislature are not actually covered by Statehouse reporters themselves. One of the things that news organizations have done is they've both expanded their beat system, and so you have education reporters, environment reporters, all of whom have a lot more knowledge substantively about their thematic issue that they're covering, right? And they're then sent, they're the ones who are sent to Olympia to say, what is this climate bill? What does it actually look like? And so they're able to bring some of their expertise to it. They tend to interview different types of sources. They're much less likely to rely on political officials in their reporting, much more likely to turn to climate scientists, activists, civil society leaders, etc. And in the less happy version of this, particularly for television, there's a tendency to send spot reporters, general assignment reporters, who are perfectly capable as reporters, but who have very little time and very few resources to be able to do their reports. And as a consequence, one of the things they are often sent in to do is to do sort of reports on what you might think of as like hot button culture war type issues, right? So, the big one in Olympia for the past few years has been the degree to which parents should be informed about children who may wish to do gender reassignment, particularly in their teenage years. And this is something where there's been much more reporting on it than there actually has been legislated. And so it can kind of create a sort of distorted thing. Then there's a last piece of the adaptation and renewal, and that's that there are a whole series of new organizations that are involved. I suspect some of these may be familiar to you, but I'll just mention a few of them. Washington State Standard is part of State's Newsroom, which is a national effort. It's a nonprofit to try and put reporters in newsrooms in every state. They operate in all 50 states in the country. But you've also got something like Washington Observer, which has been founded by a longtime Associated Press reporter who thought, you know what, I can do something that's more interesting to me and that I can get just a small number of people to buy a subscription for. And I can do like coverage that's really insider oriented, but of a quality that's much better than what someone might get if they're just, have a subscription to, the Seattle Times or something like that. Now, why do I mention that? Well, one of the issues, I think, in terms of the implications, is that for journalism, I really do think there are opportunities. And I'm not just saying this because, of course, everybody always ends on a happy note, but it really is true that for students in the room, science or journalism, if you're interested in getting into the news business, one of the best ways to do it sincerely is to go do a Statehouse internship. Even if you're not interested in politics, you'll learn more practical skills, you'll meet more people, and you'll have more career opportunities as a result. And so there are absolutely more opportunities. There are different types of news organizations. But of course, there are concerns about sustainability. Sustainability economically, because a lot of the efforts are nonprofit, but also there are concerns about professional sustainability. One of the things that we found is that the number of years in which anyone stays in a particular position at the Statehouse is very, very, very small. And so there is, in some sense, a difficulty of having a degree of stability where people see Statehouse reporting or political journalism as the type of beat that they want to work on for a long period of time because it's meaningful, because it's sustainable, etc. And we find that for a lot of people, they'll say, I'm glad I did it. Now it's time for me to get out because I don't want to be surrounded by politicians all the time, or I don't want to be, working at all hours in order to do this. And so it's very difficult to find, sort of basic quality of life and also professional meaning. The bigger question, I think, is about what it means for democracy. And one of the things that we found is that there's simultaneously kind of two trajectories that are being pursued. On the one hand, there's these efforts to try and bring in people, citizens who are uninterested, and to find ways to make them interested. When they look at how policies will impact everyday people, you can see that as one effort. And it's being pursued by at least some of the news organizations. But at the same time, the biggest sort of business growth opportunity in state government reporting is for people who want to pursue a very small audience, and they want to monetize that audience, and they want to speak to them in ways that reflects their high level of political knowledge and political competency. And in that ways, we have at the Statehouse level a sort of issue that in some ways is the oldest normative issue in the books for political journalists. And that's when they do their reporting, are they trying to engage those who are disengaged and expand the number of people who find this reporting interesting, who see it as a way to be relevant in their lives, who in some sense envision the role of the journalist as something like an educator, as saying, I think that there are things important, and here's how we can get more people involved. Or is it doing an enormously impressive job of providing news for those who already understand the political system, right? In a lot of ways, that's kind of the debate that we see here. It's a debate we see more generally, nationally, and even internationally in political journalism. So I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention, etc.
Thank you. That's fantastic by both of you. I am the chair of the Department of Journalism and Media Production at the Merrill College. I'm a professor of practice. So I'm going to speak to the practitioner's point of view on this. And because I'm a former journalist, I did bring PowerPoint slides. Also, if I open up PowerPoint, I think it's off the rails with all this. So I want to, and I graduated from graduate school in the year 2000. So you've nicely summarized the last quarter century of the news industry in which I lived part-time before coming into academia. I would say, as a counterpoint to some of this, and I'm really keen to get to the discussion so we can flesh out some of this. If you're interested in Washington state politics, if you're interested in politics at any level, local government, national level, there is more information available to you at free or low cost than ever in the history of the state. Now, one of the challenges that we face with this is the willingness of the public to engage with that content. Are you going to go on TVW and watch a Senate subcommittee meeting? Probably not. And the decline in trust in the media that says that's led to this situation where even if we produce more reporters in the Capitol and Olympia, we put more bodies there, they produce more content, the distribution machinery of the news ecosystem, as Jen mentioned, has broken down. Both from the closure of a lot of these publications and news outlets, but also because of this erosion of trust that we've seen over the same time. So even if we're presenting this information, it's still not being received or consumed by the news media. So it would be fantastic if we could solve the problem by simply putting 20 more journalists in Olympia on a regular basis and having them cover it. But we've got, unfortunately, these really foundational issues. So I just logged out of that. I also oversee the Merrill News Fellowship Program, which is a state-funded initiative to increase coverage of civic issues across the state of Washington. As part of this, we're now in our second year of operation. We send out 16 fellows across Washington state on 2-year reporting appointments with media organizations. There's 3 main pillars of this program that we think are very important. One, we want to inform communities about what's happening locally. 2, we want to provide ongoing training and support to help better prepare young journalists and emerging journalists, and also to retain them within the industry. And 3, a big part of this when we proposed this was we want to see if this works, right? We want to come up with a good sense of whether or not this program is succeeding, and also if we can just get a better understanding of the news ecosystem in general. And so that was Jen's task, a sort of unenviable task of figure this all out. We've never done anything to the depth or the scale of what Jen and her team has done, which is map all these locations and all this information that people are using to access this information across the state. As part of our program, so we have 16 fellows. Some are in very rural areas. Of those fellows, a quarter of them speak a foreign language or another language, which makes them one of the most diverse reporting cores in the state. Also means that we're able to access content and stories that have traditionally not been accessed by larger news organizations. We also set aside some funding to put fellows in Olympia for the legislative session. So right now we have 2 fellows over there. We had 3 at the start of the session, all of whom had covered politics previously and had some sense of the Washington State Legislature. So we have one dedicated to providing coverage for news outlets, and another who provides content for broadcast television, which historically has not viewed Olympia as a priority coverage area. And so we're really providing all this content to state broadcasters from Seattle to Tri-Cities to Spokane to Pullman. So it was key that we are there during the legislative session, that we're providing ongoing coverage. One of the things that I think we get lost in when we think about coverage of the legislature is we focus on the session, which obviously is where the bulk of the legislature conducts its work. But then we see, if you've been in Olympia at the end of the session, you see this sort of exodus of all these journalists and all these politicians from this town. And we then see this significant decline of people left behind to cover the actual implementation and of those rules and those laws. To give you a sense of that, to my knowledge, most daily newspapers at the turn of the century, which is a strange phrase for me to use, had someone dedicated to covering the Department of Ecology, to the Department of Social and Health Services, and now Children and Family Services. These were dedicated reporters who didn't just cover the legislative happenings, but covered the implementation of those laws and those policies, and how those were actually playing out in the lives of individuals. And so that was an incredibly, I think, valuable thing that we lost as well, that when we simply sort of look at the legislative session, we lose some of that. And so I think that's where Matthew's work is so valuable, to look at those folks who stayed throughout that time period. I think it's becoming more apparent that we need to look at news and journalism as part of our infrastructure, and that we need to invest in infrastructure in the ways that we've invested in roads, broadband internet, all these other things. We have failed to invest in journalism and news and the information that travels over those broadband networks to the same degree that we've invested in other forms of infrastructure. This is tricky business. As if you listen to my voicemails or look at the emails that I receive or the public records request, it's tricky for the state to become involved in journalism and news. However, I think it's also naive to say the state has never been involved in journalism and news. And our program is, as transparent as we can be. We built in firewalls so that I don't see editorial content that we distribute these fellows out to the news organizations. The journalists in the field make those editorial decisions. That's a firewall that's critically important for public trust and also the integrity of this program. But even when we do all that and we create amazing information and pieces of journalism, the last mile of our news infrastructure is getting people to then consume it and trust it, and that raises some really serious questions about sort of next steps in repairing the system. So I want to jump to the conversation, but I'll leave you with sort of those main points.
So we've got almost 15 minutes for questions, and we can open up to the audience right here. I'll lead off then, because I do have a question for you, Matt. And I just wondered if you'd consider the relationship between the relative youth and inexperience of the press corps, that while they're bringing these new and exciting ideas into the legislature in terms of reporting from the Statehouse, is it possible that because they haven't been around a long time, there's less impetus for them, they have the fewer contacts to do exactly that kind of investigative reporting that might then lead to the kind of stories that would attract people to be reading more about stories from the Statehouse. So I'm just thinking there might be a bit of an effect there.
Yeah, although it's not necessarily that those, so it might be that in terms of investigation, there might be slightly less interest, although there I don't think that's necessarily the case. But a lot of it is like more contextual, like longer form reporting that looks at how this is going to impact people. There's really a strong interest in being able to do it. And in fact, the difficulty is ever actually having the conditions under which they can actually exercise that vision of Statehouse reporting. And that's mostly because if you're the only person, Seattle Times has one person. Seattle Times, biggest newspaper in the state, they have one person who's covering this full time. And for very good reasons, the editor, who's overseeing you is not going to be happy if you say, I didn't go to this press conference and I'm not following that bill because I'm working on this longer form piece that I promise you will be really great. Then they're going to say, well, why do we have you there all the time, et cetera. And so I don't think that part's necessarily a function of age per se. The age part I actually take to be a function of the unacceptability of the conditions for people who were there a long time. They saw that it changed, and it wasn't primarily just the money part that changed. It was just like, why do I want to be involved in this kind of downsizing? Why would I keep doing it? And so there's departure there, and then that opens up opportunity. And so I think the big piece of it was actually the people leaving, and then that sort of brings in new people who also have new ideas and new profiles and stuff.
So you touched on how there's like less budget for journalism everywhere, for like people are working with less resources, and then I also heard that people don't want to hire volunteers or freelancers necessarily because it increases skepticism. And it's important to have people in the Capitol after legislation's passed, but there's not enough journalists to do that. How do you kind of bridge the gap until there maybe is more trust in journalism and more money in journalism? Like, is there, are journalists using like AI more? And how would you kind of bridge the gap to keep, to start increasing trust in journalism while also increasing, I guess, funds?
Yeah, so on the budget question, a lot of the news organizations that responded to this survey did indicate that they had $250,000 per year as their annual operating budget or less. That said, I also showed a slide about the staffing, and it said about a certain percentage have 2 full-time editorial staff. But actually what we found were a lot of news organizations, because of not being able to fund full-time editorial staff, were relying on freelancers and volunteers. And so there is like a greater reliance actually on more precarity, like journalists who are engaged in precarious positions, because there's not as much funding or resources to employ people full time. Does that get to your first question?
Yeah, I guess what's your recommendation for like if it's not a good idea for journalism to maybe depend on freelancers because it decreases public trust? What's kind of your recommendation for how that's something that...
I'm not sure that it does decrease public trust. I think it's harder to engage in detailed stories if you're relying. It depends on the news organization, right? You can have amazing freelancers going out and covering things. It depends a lot on sort of the circumstances that they're facing. I think the trust question is a much broader issue facing local news organizations as well as national organizations. I will say that trust in local news does tend to be higher than trust in national media. But then there's also sort of this ripple effect where if the media are sort of demonized, right, like politically, rhetorically, or whatever, local journalists are feeling kind of that heat in their communities because of what's happening nationally. And so that's playing out in different cases across the US as well. AI, there's a lot of mixed feelings about artificial intelligence. I can't tell you if to what extent news organizations are using it. It really depends, right, on the news organization and what way they may be using it. There's a lot of skepticism about it. There's use of it in some cases in more rote tasks, right, which might not be as problematic as if it was being used to generate more robust stories. But I think the verdict is really still out there. And so we'll just have to see as time progresses, like how it might be utilized more.
I think part of the issue with freelancers is, number one, nobody wants to buy a political story out of Olympia. They want to buy an entertainment story. They want to read about sports. There's not a great market for political journalism unless you really or build up your own brand. You're an established person. If you're a young freelancer and you say, hey, I want to cover this piece of legislation, will you pay me a livable wage to do it? Most media outlets, because really of our viewing habits and our consumption habits, there's just not, we don't place much value on political news. So it's a really difficult thing to sort of create this freelance model for. It also is incredibly precarious for the journalists themselves to be relying story to story to pay their bills. And it can also lead to a situation, I think, that's problematic, where you need to sell a story and you need to market a story to get paid. And so you are really sort of beholden to the needs or desires of the consumer rather than what is best at informing the public.
So this is a question sort of at the intersection of funding and skepticism. And we see the project that you talked about, the Fellows Program, really the public funding for local journalism. And how would you see the political skepticism that was discussed as it filters down to the state and the future for this type of funding model, and maybe the ability to affect that?
Yeah, so a number of thoughts on that. We used to trust the media, right? We've lost trust in the media. We've lost trust in police, law enforcement. We've lost trust in the court system. We've lost trust in government. We've lost trust in medical establishment and vaccines. We've lost trust across society, right? And so the trust factor is sort of almost an aside, right? If you don't trust the media, it doesn't really matter to you whether it's funded by taxpayers or whether it's funded by Jeff Bezos. I mean, I think there's a good question of, are we better off having billionaires buy up prominent media brands and sort of direct those media organizations? If we look at Bezos, who paid $250 million for one of the most important brands in American media history, the Washington Post, and Bezos is worth $225 billion, right? This is a rounding error in his checkbook to be able to own one of the most prominent media organizations in the country. The problem is we've lost trust in all media, right? And so how do we repair that? How do we get that back at this point? It doesn't matter who is the funding behind it. We're not going to trust it anyways. And if we're producing good journalism, if we're producing good content, we may be delivering it to a mass audience that doesn't trust it or is going to avoid it entirely altogether. And those are separate problems to be dealt with.
Do you think we've got time for another question? Take it away.
I could, so Richard at the beginning was trying to guilt us into subscribing to local newspapers. I find whenever I buy a local newspaper, there's very little content I find of interest. I'll even go to a big city, like was in Philadelphia, bought the Sunday newspaper, and well, that held my attention for a very short time. If I need my fix for news from Olympia, I go to the Washington State Standard, which is free. I guess how much should I worry if the Spokesman Review goes out of business? How bad is it? Why should I care?
So I'm a big supporter of newspapers, and as Jen's research has shown, that is the primary news gathering outlet in our region. I think just the fact that we have a public presence, that journalists are showing up to public meetings and holding law enforcement accountable, those have benefits to you, I would argue, even as if you're a non-reader. There's policy that results from those. There's accountability and transparency that benefits the broader society, even if it doesn't necessarily hold our interest on a regular basis. The competition for information and eyeballs is so difficult right now. that it is difficult for journalists to produce content that's going to be as compelling as what we see on on our phones on a regular basis. It takes, I think, a prioritization of our media diets to say, okay, I'm going to have enjoyment media, and then I'm also going to have this educational component to my media diet that says I need to know what's going on in the state capitol or in DC or wherever it might be. That takes a discipline, which I'm sure you have, Dr. Riddell, but I'm not sure that we as a broader society have in our sort of media diet right now.
I will say though, in the Spokesman Review in particular, right, there's an editorial decision to really focus on Gonzaga basketball, right? To make sure that it's front and center to get people to subscribe and to read, and then also, hey, check out this really important political content, right? So I don't think that's like, people are aware of what people come for when they're subscribing to news organizations. I think Rob Curley does a really good job at the Spokesman Review, like threading that needle basically to get people to subscribe.
I was gonna say, I'll try and just flip the question a little bit in the sense that I do think society loses something when journalists go away. So I think many of the things that have been said about when news or newspapers goes away are important. I think they vary, like, should we all subscribe to an Alden Capital newspaper that's basically just, flushing out its newsroom? I don't see the utility there, but, I subscribe to the Seattle Times. It's useful for me in certain ways. I wish it was better in other ways, but okay, fair. But what's actually lost? Well, I think journalists are the sort of canary in the coal mine for a certain type of job that we used to think of as vocations that people go into, not because they want to become rich, but because they want to do something meaningful. And I think journalists are in that way not so different from nurses, not so different from teachers, all of whom have crises of retention and recruitment, because it's increasingly difficult not to get someone interested. I was in Jen's class earlier, I was talking with them. It's not that difficult to get people interested in it because it seems like a life that's substantial, that's meaningful, that's connected to broader values, all of things that you could say about nursing and teaching and other things like that. And yet we live in societies now where the conditions that are necessary for actually making that fulfilling in the short term and definitely in the long term is increasingly difficult and is increasingly narrow for a few. What's lost in all of that? I think that what's lost is a society that's incapable of offering its citizens meaningful work. And I think that that's a very foundational, fundamental feature of societies writ large that journalists are sort of at the forefront of, but not articulating it in that way.
I just want to add too, sorry if we have 1 minute. Newspapers are very important for forming social cohesion, right? So when somebody starts to enter a new community, right, they want to be able to communicate with others around them. And so newspapers are a really good way of like allowing that to happen. And so that would be lost potentially if the Spokesman Review went away. So I think that's really important. And then of course, like political polarization, right, in the connection to local news and the importance of local news, being able to comment on different values that people have, right, and having that sort of back and forth and the sort of the downstream effect of how it relates to political polarization.
Might be one more point. And I appreciate you teeing up the question because in 48 hours, 4 of our students are going to board a plane, travel to Germany, and go to Buchenwald concentration camp, which is where Edward R. Murrow delivered one of the most famous broadcasts in the history of American journalism on the horrors of the Holocaust. Now I'm taking this to the extreme. Sometimes we send our students to Olympia, sometimes we send them to Colfax. Now we're sending them to Buchenwald. Journalists are very much sort of, obviously, as we say, the first messy draft of history. They're public historians. If we look at the rise of the far right in Germany right now, the importance of that documentation by White, by Edward R. Murrow, by others, the importance of that 80 years later, right, to still be able to have that documentation of what happened is so critically important to us as a society that it's well worth your $10 a month to subscribe to your local newspaper. So there's my pitch.
Well, and I think that was a really great place to end the talks today. A real exaltation and defence and impassioned plea to support journalism, which I imagine all of us will be taking on board. I think so. Could you all please thank me and join me in thanking Jen, Matt, and Ben for a really great talk. No, thanks a lot.